right, everyone. So we have Eric Helms here. He is the less famous but better dancing Chris Evans. And so I've followed Eric's work for a long time. I think you probably came on the scene more so around 2011 or so. Is that right? Roughly then?
Man, yeah, if you knew me before 2011, you were probably someone on like the bodybuilding.com forums. So,
yeah, I remember seeing Lane Norton on them, straight flex and everything back then.
Yeah.
'Cause, I mean, I was on the forums back in 2005, way too obsessively, way too much time on there.
Same.
Yeah, I think we actually probably got into it a similar timeline.
Yes.
I got started when I was around 12, getting into sports then. But I didn't really know too much about you until 2011, and then you really blew up a few years after that. So right now, your main project, I mean, you obviously spent a long time getting your PhD, right? And so that finished 2 years ago, is that right?
Just about a year ago now. I defended my PhD last year. I believe it might have been August 2017. So yeah, I officially graduated, later that year in December. But yeah, so it's been about a year since I did everything I had to do officially, as far as.
And now you're doing, like, is it like a fellowship or something like that? I thought I saw you're a fellow there.
Yeah, so I'm what's called a research fellow at the same place. It's Sports Performance Research Institute, New Zealand, under the flag of AUT, and that's essentially a part-time role that I do, where I get to be still involved with the research. Largely, what I do is I engage with the strength and conditioning students. So we set up a monthly meeting just to kind of make sure everyone is getting the support they need, sharing ideas. We have typically a group speaker just to kind of do continuing education on a more critical thinking level for S&C students. And then I supervise students, so master's and PhD students. I can have up to like 8, which is a great way to mentor people, help them keep the field moving forward, and keep my toe in the water of research.
Very cool. Okay. And as we talked about, so a lot of these videos, part of the point behind this is for me to get some information out to people and also bring awareness to charities. And so talking with Eric a little bit before this, he was gracious enough to have today's donation go towards Operation Smile, which is the main charity that I've been supporting since 2011 or so, which helps children with cleft lip and palate. That's been a big thing that I've been doing, and he said that we could go with that one for today, so that's great. And then tying in with the research, so you developed MASS, right, monthly application of strength sport, right?
Yeah. Greg called me up just around the tail end of my PhD and said, "Hey man, I want to start a research review for physique athletes and strength athletes." And I was like, dude, I'm so in. So
yeah. I mean, it's a huge undertaking. I mean, were you ever so you were just right away, you were down for it?
Well, I tell you what, man, long ago, I thought, how cool would it be to really just have something in that space that's directed at just, the community I'm trying to serve. A little difference I'm trying to make in the world of helping strength and physique athletes do their thing in a more healthy, sustainable way. How cool would it be to get that out to them? So it was always in the back of my head. And then when Greg called me, I thought that'd be really cool. And then when I called up Zerdos and asked him to get involved, and he was keen, then we were all very much excited about it. So it was certainly an undertaking, because we knew that we needed to be very high quality. We wanted to provide a few things that most other research reviews weren't doing at that time, like video. We wanted to get into continuing education. We want to provide audio. We're still trying to add stuff like closed captions to our videos if someone is hearing impaired or doesn't speak English very well, or at least at the speed that we do, et cetera, et cetera. So
very cool. Nice. And I mean, so obviously, like we said, you have your PhD, and so how do you find that helps you? Because I mean, in my opinion, there's a lot of knowledgeable people who don't have a doctor, and that's coming as somebody who has a doctor. It's still, I find that there are people who are very experienced and knowledgeable. So, what leg up do you feel that your PhD gives you in this field?
Sure. So there's a couple ways to assess that question. One is, what does the actual credential give me? The other one is, what did the process of going through a PhD give me? And I think they're very different. So from my perspective, on the inside of my own brain, looking out into the experience I had in the world, the credential itself hasn't given me much at all. it has given me the ability to be a research fellow at AET. You can't get that with anything less than a PhD, and which allows me to mentor master's and PhD students, stay involved in research. So there's but that's maybe it. It is possible that there are some people who wouldn't ask me to speak somewhere or to collaborate or do something with me previously when I was just a lowly man with a master's degree. And that's changed. That's possible, but it's not like they're emailing me saying, thanks for getting that PhD because I just thought you were like a moron before. Now that you have that
Right.
credential, I'm going to have you out. So
Right.
I don't know that it opened any new doors for me per se. If I was obviously getting into academics, that would have been the only door that avenue that I could have walked through. Any deeper academics than I am now as a research fellow. Like if I wanted to become a professor, which I don't. But now the process of getting a PhD, I think, was really, really useful because it taught me with a structured mentorship process and a ton of resources that I have at AUT and the whole community there of all the other postgrad students and researchers of going through the process of trying to answer a big question with an empirical approach that I'm actually doing. I got to learn how to do EMG. I got to learn how to do force plate testing. I got to learn how to do linear position transducer work. I got to learn how to do a full anthropometric profile to the ISAC standards. I got to learn how to do mid-thigh pull testing, high quality 1RM testing, you name it, ultrasound. So it gave me a lot of skills. I got to see how research actually works. I think that greatly improved my ability to assess the quality of other studies, to understand the limitations, and also understand what is possible and logistically feasible as far as trying to answer new questions in the research. If it's done right, and if you have the right supervisors, you get drilled into your head trying to be more impartial and trying to become aware of your biases and institute things that, even if you do have a bias, which we all do, that it doesn't get in the way of the attainment of knowledge. I've gotten to peer review other people's research. That's a thing I do probably once or twice a month now that I've published research. So it has also expanded my reach. I think getting into academia and publishing articles about things, some people, there are pockets where that's their primary avenue of research, where they're not listening to podcasts, they're not reading layperson material. They are primarily basing their thoughts on research, which I think is not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just that there are people who do that. You can affect groups like the International Society of Sports Nutrition, where they're largely getting their information and making their decisions based on peer-reviewed research, or the CSCSs in the NSCA, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's allowed me to broaden my reach. It's allowed me to better fine-tune the quality of the information I put out, and it's allowed me to give back. I think that's the big thing, getting into research after the undergraduate or professional master's level. Once you get into research-based degrees, you have the opportunity to actually add to the body of knowledge, and you get a sense of contributing back to the community you're part of, which I think is everything, personally.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree with all of that. Like you said, there's the credentialing, but so I was exercise science and nutrition in college, and that was my degree from college. But I remember even like my freshman year, and at that point, I had been involved with this stuff at least, to some degree, 6 or 7 years. And I remember kind of getting in this argument with this girl in the major, and she was also a freshman, and she didn't know I was that major also. And I remember her argument was, I'm an exercise science major. Like, I know what I'm talking about, as if 2 weeks into being this major, that means anything. But even in reality, I mean, having that degree, I mean, it means something, but that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean something. Whereas that process, I think, is hugely different, because when you talk to people who have gone through that process, there's oftentimes, not always, but there's oftentimes a different way of looking at the research and realizing that we all have biases, realizing how much you don't know a lot of the time, I find. And so that, I think, is the difference in thinking about it. But not, if you look at Greg Nuckols, extremely intelligent guy. I don't know. I don't think he has a PhD. I'm not sure if he has a master's or not, but just an example of somebody who hasn't gone through a PhD, but obviously extremely knowledgeable, provides a ton. So it's not, definitive thing, but I've just noticed that there is a difference in thinking at times. And then also in terms of the content, I mean, I guess the average person who's watching YouTube videos might not know. If you mention Golgi tendon organs, they probably never heard that term for the most part, or something like that. And the research aspect helps as well. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Nicholas Radamus. Do you know that name?
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's a big time legend in the field. And just for the record, Greg is doing his masters. So
he is, okay. Yeah.
That means very soon we can start listening to him, but we don't take his information as seriously as mine. That's just the take home there.
Right. So I actually worked with Dr. Radamus in college, and I didn't realize how big of a deal he was at the time. He's now the editor-in-chief in the journal Strength and Conditioning Research, I believe. I think he just got that role, but and I also found out he was on the doctoral committee for Dr. Schoenfeld, which I just realized that too. But I was like looking back, and so I might do some work with him again in the future. But yeah, extremely knowledgeable guy, also extremely impressive guy, who's deadlifting I think 675 for 1 or 2 reps back when I was working with him. So he's a beast.
Love it.
So yeah, he's awesome. So your most recent article of Mass, one of the articles or things you talked about was maintaining motivation in the long run, is something you guys talked about. And I really like that because when you start this, it's never easy to be motivated, but when you're gaining 15 or even 5 pounds of muscle a year, you go in there and you kill yourself in 2-hour leg workouts or an hour leg work or whatever it is, and it's going to pay off. But eventually, a lot of times you get to a point where you're killing yourself in there, and you kind of know in the back of your head, like, this is barely going anywhere. I'm doing these grueling workouts, and I could probably maintain with a lot less than what I'm putting my body through. So what are some of the key things you found there to maintain that motivation after 10, 15 years?
That's a great question, and I'm really glad that you liked that video, because that's one of the more favorite pieces I put into Mass. So I think inherent in the way you frame that question is the problem. If you are looking at it as what do I put in and then what do I get out of it, eventually your motivation is no longer going to match the realities of your physiology, right? So just like you said, that's a fine perspective to have when you're a newbie with even decent genetics, because you're probably going to gain maybe upward of 10% of your body weight in the first 2 years of largely muscle mass, or at the very least not seeing your body fat percentage go up,
Sure.
And yeah, your strength, man, I try to think back to, I think I have pretty good genetics just for putting on muscle initially. If I just look at what I've gained compared to others, I don't think I necessarily have great genetics for my ceiling is, but man, so this is relevant. Looking at what I initially gained, I basically doubled my squat, bench, and deadlift within 1 to 2 years,
Wow.
And
what were you up to in about 1 to 2 years? I'm curious.
Right, those classic not really short male intermediate numbers. So I benched 320, I deadlifted 495, and I squatted 405.
And that was after 2 years.
That was after 2 years, and now I've been training for 14, and I've basically put 10% on each one of those lifts since then.
Yeah, wow. And were you around college age at that time, like 18? I don't know what time. Okay.
So I started lifting the inverse age of you. I started lifting at 21.
Yeah.
Not 12, which I'm jealous of. And I then, and now I'm 35. So I've been lifting, a little over 14 years. It'll be 15 in, I think, June of next year or something like that, maybe May. But yeah, so the best numbers I've hit now, just to put it in perspective, I've hit a 556 deadlift, so just a 10% increase since 495.
Yeah.
The best squat I've done is 495, which is more like a 20% increase. And then the best deadlift bench press I've done is 363, touch and go. So that's another 20%. Right. So basically, my deadlift has made the worst gains apparently. Now that I've done the math, and I feel like that's maybe indicative of something. But
I've never really had a good reference personally, because starting so young, you just have puberty gains. So I was, how much have I gained? I've gained 65 pounds of muscle, but since I was 12. So it's very hard to gauge. I mean, right now I'm only about 195. So, how much have I really gained compared to if I started at 18 or so? I don't really know. I could say I put on 400 pounds to my deadlift, but
Yeah. Some of that's just not being 5'2". Yeah. So,
So
So that's a tough one. Yeah. So anyway, obviously gaining 1% on something like my deadlift per year for since then is not something that you can really track, see, and it certainly feels like you're completely plateaued at times. And there was actually a 5-year period where I made no progress on my bench press. And then due to a hip injury, there was a 3-year period where I couldn't even squat
Yeah, I remember you talked
to
about
death. So if you don't shift your perspective, and if you only look at what am I getting out of from what I'm putting in, any sane person, if they assume that that was the only perspective to have, that was the objectively true perspective to have, would stop, right? Why would you keep doing this, right? So therefore, it becomes really important to shift your perspective over time. Now, there's some cool research out there that is probably wouldn't pass ethics today, where in the 70s, I think the actual title was Undermining Children's Motivation or something like that. It was in the title. And basically what they did is they went to a preschool and they just looked at all of the kids who were drawing just for fun, because that's what you do in preschool. And they broke them into 3 groups. And they didn't modify anyone's behavior. They just interacted with them regarding their behavior. So one group, they did nothing. That was the control group. They just tracked them for a period. And then after and then tracked them for the period after the period. And basically want to know how much time did they spend drawing and how did it change over time. And then the 2 other groups, one, they started rewarding for drawing and telling them they were going to do it. Hey, the more you draw, we're going to give rewards based on the order of who draws the most. And then the other group, they gave the same rewards, but didn't tell them they were going to. So at the end of this 8-week period, all of a sudden, oh shit, I got a reward for being the kid who draws the most.
Right.
And they found that in the group that got a reward but wasn't told they're going to get a reward, and the group that wasn't rewarded at all, in the period after the tracked period, they were drawing twice as much as the group that was told they were going to get a reward and got it. Meaning that
intrinsic motivation.
Yes. And even in people who already were doing it for a different reason, right? So meaning if you were doing something recreationally for fun and someone came up to you and said, hey, because you're doing this, I'm now going to give you a reward and it'll be higher than these other people. And then once the reward goes away, your motivation is shifted enough that you're more likely to not be interested in it.
Right.
And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people who lift weights and love lifting weights get focused on something more extrinsic, be that a bodybuilding trophy, a powerlifting goal, or even just something non-structured, like I want to deadlift 500 pounds, or I want to bench 3 plates, or something like that. And then once they reach it, they struggle to stay involved. And I've met really high level, or previously very high level lifters who don't lift anymore. Not they don't lift to win powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting things anymore. They just don't lift at all.
Right.
And to me, that is just tragic, because I know what it takes to get to that level. I haven't gotten to that level, but I've tried,
Sure.
So
Right.
I put in a similar level of effort and not gotten championship level, but definitely I got to sit on the sidelines and cheer them on. So I put in the same work that they have, and to think, man, what if I just stopped? It would just feel like such a blow, such a waste almost. So as a coach, this is something I've seen as well, and I typically try to do a few things. One is I take what is called a supportive athlete-centered approach to coaching. So autonomy supported coaching is coaching that is based on the concept of self-determination theory. So self-determination theory is currently the best guess at how people tick and what makes them do what they do and how that's modified. And that says that people have 3 large kind of domains that dictate their happiness and their fulfillment in life, and typically will predict how self-efficacious they are and how intrinsically motivated they are, and likely how successful they'll be by their own metrics. And that's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So essentially, do you feel like you have direction in your own life? Autonomy. Do you have support from peers and people who care about you and that you care about? Relatedness. And then do you feel like you know what you're doing and getting better at it? Competence. So all coaches coach the competence side of it, but how they do it, whether they're authoritarian and it's top down, and whether they punish their athletes for not doing well, or whether they tell the athlete, hey, this is about you, not me. I'm here to support you. I'm the navigator, you're the captain. And then, even in individual sports like bodybuilding or track and field, do they create, team values with all of their athletes? Do they have things like a Facebook group or whatever kind of,
right.
whether they're online or in-person coaches? If they do the things to try to focus on building autonomy and not only just competence in the skill, but also competence as a person, like a bigger picture, more holistic coaching approach that is athlete-centered and includes community support. If they do all of those things, it tends to predict athletes who become more intrinsically motivated and have greater self-efficacy. So there was a cool study, I think it was by Ambrose, where those athletes who reported coaches who used autonomy supportive coaching style tended to be more intrinsically motivated. So that means that just having that coaching style is more likely for you to stay in the game.
Right.
Because you're doing it for reasons that are more intrinsic. Another big thing that I think is important is just shifting your perspective. So less from the coach's side, but if you're just an athlete listening to this, I think especially in an individual sport that's not a combat sport, or just fitness in general, where it's really just about you and there's no defense. Like, when I get on stage, I can't actually side kick the dude who's doing a front row bicep next to me. I mean,
get some points.
I could, yeah. I don't know if they'd let me stay on stage. If we're wearing Dream Tan, we'd probably just slip and fall down. But nonetheless, it is just basically moving from I'm doing the show to win the show to I'm doing the show to be the best I can be. And this kind of creates this scenario, like some of the early interventions I use with athletes who are very focused on winning is to tell them, hey, you can't change how they train. And I don't think it'll be productive to get angry when someone who you didn't know was going to do the show, who's just a freak, shows up. Like that,
right.
that changes your behavior, not at all. So let's just focus on you improving yourself as best you can and beating the previous version. And I think that's an important first step, but I don't actually think it's the last step. So, I've had athletes do things like just put last season's pictures of themselves on the wall, post about how they're going to beat that guy or gal. And I think that's great. But, being 35 now, not that that's ancient, but it's certainly not young in terms of athleticism. And having had hip surgery and having had a scare with my neck where I thought I might have to have hip surgery and having tore my hamstring back in 2009, you get a sense of mortality, and even when you recover and things go well and you learn from it and all that, you recognize that there is a clock ticking, as kind of grim as that sounds, to where, you might not be able to do this for forever. And even if you can do it for a very long time into Masters 2, you're probably not going to be winning the pro worlds when you're 70, There are some highly impressive people out there like Marshall Johnson who are, winning in their early 50s, but A, they're not common. And B, you don't know if that's going to be you. So you kind of have to think about this from, why am I doing this? Why did I first start lifting weights? And I think it's really important to get back to the love of the process. Because there's another group of studies where they looked at either being goal-focused or process-focused. And they found that the best, most equivalent of these studies is on treadmill running. So they asked people who were going to run on a treadmill, they put them into two groups. One group would specifically focus on and state what the goals of treadmill running were. And that might be, losing body fat, improving their VO2 max, getting in better shape, etc. But it was some extrinsic goal. And then after they stated the goal, they had to state how long they thought they would run. And then they had an untime restricted task of just running to see how long they ran. The other group, we were asked to focus on what aspects of running did they enjoy, what did they like, how did it make them feel, and then predict how long they'd run and then see how long they ran. And the people who were focused on a goal and an outcome predicted a higher amount and then ran for less time. There's a greater disparity. The group that focused on the process ran longer than they predicted that they would, and longer than the other group as well. So it's difference within group compared to what you expected, and between group compared to what actually happened. So this is the kind of thing where you have an athlete, and in bodybuilding this is really common, where they're thinking about their next meal. Part of that's just being hungry. They're planning out their workouts well in advance. sometimes even into the off season before they've even stepped on stage. And then when they're not eating or prepping meals or thinking about meals or thinking about training or training, they're on some kind of website or podcast, listening to things about bodybuilding,
Sure.
thinking about bodybuilding, researching supplements that they can take that might enhance their fat loss, counting their steps when they walk around, so that every minute of every day is delved into achieving the goal they want. And I think that's actually really counterproductive. I think you need to live your life as a human who body builds and tick all those boxes, but not dwell on it, because I think that becomes a huge mental drain.
Yeah.
So all of that together tells me that we want to shift towards getting back to loving the process. And as coaches, we need to really focus on an athlete-centered approach. And I think doing those things, I've seen some much better happiness, longevity, and career-based outcomes among my athletes and myself, where otherwise they may have done a couple shows and been burned out. And I can't tell you how many times you meet people in the sport of bodybuilding or powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting where they told you how they used to do it and then burned out, or it wasn't worth it, or it was unhealthy, or it became a barrier to the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the psychology in this sport or, activity is really amazing. I mean, I think there's a kind of a trend among the people who really get into it. I don't know, there's kind of like an obsessive compulsive nature to it. I mean, definitely for me, I know when I was in high school and I used to write on my calendar, like every day I went by without having a cheat. And like, I would try to like break my record of how long I could go. And I went months without having a cheat, to the point that like I missed Thanksgiving because I just thought I had to do it, and there's just this obsessive nature to it. And it didn't help anything, I mean, I think we'd all, when we get started, we'd like to believe that the more obsessive we are and we have 10 meals a day and we, get sleep as much other time, and that should work. Right. And then when it doesn't, or, you still are kind of, you have friends who maybe have better genetics who do half the work. And if you are so tied to the result, it kind of becomes depressing. And that's what you see in a lot of people, where they get so obsessed with it and then they just drop off because it wasn't what they thought it was, or the lifestyle just wasn't as good as they had hoped. And then, like there's this huge drop off. So it's really interesting. And that's probably one of the most important things you deal with as a coach. And, for some of the people I've trained, it's setting expectations, and making sure that their reason for doing it is correct. Because for most people getting started, I think it's not. I think they look at it for, a lot of times they tell me like, I want to look like this person, or I can't wait to like show this off to whoever. And then that's cool to have that goal. I mean, I think we're all a little superficial, but if that's the inherent reason, that doesn't last 10, 20 years most of the time.
Absolutely. No, you're right. And I think that's a really good point you make, because there's nothing inherently wrong with external motivation. It's only a problem when it's the primary or in the absence of any internal motivation. Like there would be no reason to get on stage or do the sport at all if you didn't actually want to compete. And inherent in the desire to compete is the desire to do well. I've never met, even the most intrinsically motivated bodybuilders I know would prefer to win than place last.
Sure. Yeah, right.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and that can be used as a nice kind of super driver to the motivation you have. Like, oh, I'm going to get on this stage. I know this guy's going to be here. This is my chance to compete against a hero of mine, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I think that's really good. I think it's easy for people to go, well, if it's not A, it should be B. Like intrinsic motivation, good. Extrinsic, bad. But it's obviously much more complex than that. And I look at it as kind of like a layered cake, like if we have our cake, our frosting, and then like our cherry on top, which doesn't sound like a very good cake now that I say it. Assuming we have this bad cake, the cake itself would be love of the process. The frosting, the next largest part, would be trying to improve, and then the cherry on top would be winning.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the way I always position it. And then you can self-assess whether or not your cake's in order. If you really enjoyed prep, it went really well, like you clearly learned and improved upon your last season. And then, when you see pictures and you look at all the objective markers of how well you did, to powerlifter, that's easy. Did you total more? To bodybuilder, it's a little more subjective. But if you improved, it's the best you've ever done, and the process went really well, and you were able to enjoy it as much as you can, and then you place really poorly, if that ruins everything for you, then maybe these are just kind of words you're saying, that's what you believe, and you don't actually really in your gut deep down believe that to be the case, and that opens up a whole avenue for self-exploration and hopefully reframing.
Right. So I'm curious, with all your years of coaching, some people are going to be easier to train, some are harder. What are, aside from how much effort they put in, but just looking at the whole, what were some of the best and worst genetics you've seen? Because, I don't like to put too much on genetics in the sense that obviously it can be used as an excuse, but this is one of the most genetically driven activities out there. A lot of sports, there's a big skill component where if you have bad genetics for tennis, but you play for 15 years, you're still going to beat people who played for a year most of the time. But there are some bodybuilders who do this for 2 years and they blow away everyone. So I'm just curious we see all the great examples of genetics, but I'm just interested to see who you've seen that just had just truly bad genetics. If you just couldn't find that much to help them, if you've come across that.
Okay, everyone get out your pens. I'm going to give you names and addresses of people with bad genetics now. I want you to write this down. No. No, but I've definitely seen the full gambit. I've had people who, when we do everything right, you have to squint hard at an angle and wait 3 months before you go, you progressed,
Right. Yeah.
One of the things I have used as a transition is helping people focus on things that they do better. I have definitely seen damn near close to what I would call a non-responder or two in bodybuilding training. And this also has something to do with they come to us after the complete novice stage. So they've been lifting for 6 months at least, almost always. So whatever initial gains they would have made in hypertrophy have happened. But maybe there's really not much left to be had, or the changes are damn near not noticeable. However, what I've never seen is someone who doesn't get stronger. And, that makes sense from the perspective that, neurological adaptations, muscle architectural adaptations that are not hypertrophy, and coordination, technical skill, self-efficacy, all go into your ability to exert force, right? So I've never seen someone who just can't get stronger unless they are in a diseased state or something like that, or in a chronic calorie deficit and I didn't know it, or something like that. But so I have definitely taken people and said, hey, are you enjoying training? Like, yeah, I'm making great progress. I'm just a little frustrated with my physiques. And I've told them, you ever thought about doing powerlifting, mate? This is similar. I think you'll still love the training, and maybe we can direct you to somewhere where you'll feel less frustrated. Yeah. So that I think there's nothing wrong with that. Hell, I experienced it myself with the hip injury and not knowing if I'd be able to come back, and just also being, to some degree, mentally afraid of coming back in and putting, trying to get up to 500 pounds and bearing it. When last time I did that, I felt my labrum tear, I think part of me, I remember thinking, my bench is going great. I could just do bench only. Like I'm finding some outlet to express that need in me that fulfills that. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, even though it is definitely a coping mechanism. Coping mechanisms are how we make it through life. So
right.
So I think I've definitely done that, and I've seen people who within like the progress they make in a short period of time is jealousy inducing, unbelievable.
Yeah.
A great story I like to tell is when one of the first programs I put Bryce Lewis on when we decided to pursue powerlifting, he took his deadlift from high 400s to low 600s in 12 weeks. And I used a similar program for myself, and I put 25 pounds on my deadlift, which I thought was really good, which is my motivation to actually institute it. And this was early on. We're talking 2010 or 11, maybe 10, I think, when we were very first start working together. So, he went from a bodybuilding type training to a focused powerlifting training. And all of a sudden, my God, I knew this guy might be a world champion one day. And I ended up being correct. But just goes to show you that some people are just built for this, Yeah,
it is. It's kind of amazing to see the difference in strength and hypertrophy. I mean, that was probably why I got a little bit more into the powerlifting side of it, just focusing more on strength. I mean, I do obviously think that building strength is important for hypertrophy, but I know for me, when I was in college, I think when I was maybe like 19 or 20, and I was deadlifting like around 500 at 170 with 14-inch arms, maybe. Like, I mean, I was a lot smaller than plenty of my friends who lifted, but nobody deadlifted as much as me. And not even just deadlifts. I mean, a lot of my lifts were reasonable. And part of that probably has to do with lifting from such a young age. But I definitely noticed, you know, probably maybe slightly below average genetics for hypertrophy, but reasonable for strength. And I'll see the whole gambit of that, where obviously you have two, where somebody has this amazing chest, but they bench like 225 for one or something, you know, like something like not relatively impressive. And it is kind of amazing. But that's interesting what you said about kind of shifting their focus, because while I think it's great to pursue what you love, I think it's also easier to love something you're good at or getting results at to some degree. I mean, if you're just constantly bashing your head against the wall and you're doing everything right, that can be frustrating. And so that going to a more powerlifting approach is, I think, it's a pretty good idea for that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got to hook into what makes you happy, for sure, if you want to stick with something long term.
Yeah. So something I wanted to bring up is obviously the new Brad Schoenfeld study that came out. A lot of people have been talking about. And I think quick summary was it was like one set for the body parts 3 times a week versus, I don't remember the exact breakdown. I'm sure you know better than I do, but the total volume, I think, for lower body was 9, 27, and 45 sets, right?
Yeah.
And then what was it for upper? I know 30 was the max they did.
Yeah, I think it was
like 6 something and 30.
Yeah, it's somewhere right around there. Yeah. But it was 30 to 45 and the high end, I think 18 to 27, and then like 6 to 9 in the low.
Yeah. And then they found that the highest volume saw the greatest hypertrophy, which, you know, we do see that volume is one of the greatest drivers of hypertrophy, but I think a lot of people were surprised to see it to that extent, or 45 sets for lower body. Would you find that, or do you find that that's kind of true in your experience? Because obviously the studies are important, but, you know, I mean, you can find countless examples when talking to people online or training where you cut back their volume and they seem to do better, and they weren't necessarily doing an insane amount of volume. Like, I've seen people go from training arms 12 to 15 sets, you know, I mean, a decently high amount to 6 sets, and they start growing again. And so I think every study we see, it just keeps saying volume is good, volume is good. Well, I mean, there was the German volume training one that was structured a little weird, that they showed 5 sets was better than 10. But just on the whole, I mean, what do you think about the new study's results and how that should be applied?
Well, I think there's a few ways to look at this. One is that the way we think about counting volume as practitioners is typically different from the way it is done for meta-analyses and the way it was done in this study and in most studies, in that whether you're doing a bench press, an overhead press, or a tricep extension, we count those as a 1-to-1 for triceps, right? And when you think about, you know, quad volume, whether that's a leg extension, a squat, or a leg press, we count it all equally in a study. So I think this gives a slightly inflated view of how much volume is actually happening. Like you said, the high-end volume group was doing 30 sets for the upper body. And, you know, one of the metrics measured was biceps thickness, right? So if we think about what is how do we get 30 sets of biceps, you know, that could be 4 sets of lat pull downs, 4 sets of rows, and then 2 bicep exercises for 34 sets each, twice per week. And no one would go, oh my God, hold the phone, that's crazy volume. How dare you do 4 sets of 4 exercises twice per week? But that's what was done to achieve some of those volumes. It isn't as mind-bogglingly as insane as it may sound when you hear, just do 45 sets per muscle group. You're like, what? You know? Knowing that every compound movement is counted for each one of the included muscles, I think changes the picture a little bit. I would also say that this is one of the first studies we have where the participants are actually quite well trained. Like you brought up the German volume training studies, and if you look at the volume in those, essentially 9 to 18 sets per muscle group outperformed twice that. And these were individuals who were barely benching body weight, males. So they were basically novices, is a good way to put that. And yeah, if you're a novice, doing that many sets is not only unnecessary, but it's probably well past your work capacity and recuperative capacity. And that's been shown actually a number of times. There is a number of studies that show a lower threshold for volume. There's Gonzalez Padillo back in 2005 had junior weightlifters, so we're talking like 15 to 18-year-olds who trained 1 to 3 years. And the moderate volume group made better strength gains than the low or the high. There's additional studies like that as well. There's one that just came out. I think it's pronounced Hazelgrave. I could be wrong. They're looking at specific isolated bicep work, but among people who are doing other training. They're allowed to do other training besides biceps, and they found that the 18-set group had a trend towards making better hypertrophy than the group that was doing, I think, closer to 27 or 30. And that's not the only one. I could do a few others. There's a study by Ostrowski where if you count the volume the same way Schoenfeld did, you see a peak in quadriceps growth around 12 sets, and then a peak in triceps growth around 14 sets. And then even when you greatly increase it from 14, it's like a 0.1% percentage change, and no significant differences. So, and each one of these studies, they're less trained. So the take home is that there is a kind of bell curve to the volume response, that as you add sets, you are going to see a dose response, not a linear dose response necessarily, but actually a diminishing return. As you invest more, you get something back, but it's less and less and less and less. And then eventually you're investing without any additional return on investment, which is just basically, fatigue and additional chance to get hurt with no benefit. And then if you keep going, then you actually start growing slower. And as we saw in those German volume training studies, if you take it so far, you actually won't even see a pre versus post change, where you're just, improving your work capacity, if anything. So that is kind of the big take home. I would also say that while people are suggesting that volume is a primary driver of growth, I think it shouldn't be forgotten that volume is essentially the dosage of what is actually making growth happen, which is tension. So you're supplying tension, and I've heard a lot of people kind of go, well, what's more important, tension or volume? And I think that's a really misguided way of looking at it. Yeah. I think volume is saying how much tension you're applying. It's what dose of the stimulus. And so I guess the take home for the Schoenfeld study is that, and there's some other interesting aspects of it. James Krieger's talked about, which I think is going to be in a different paper, so I don't want to go into it in too much depth, that the higher the volume was, the fewer non-responders there were. So that gives us some information as a practitioner that much like aerobic training, because we've seen this as far as enhancing VO2 max, it may be that the quote-unquote non-responders just simply have to do more to get a response, which is unfortunate. Now, as far as the practical side of it, I think volume, even though it has this clear effect, it should probably be the last thing you change when you're confronted with a lack of progress. I think assessing recovery, sleep, nutrition, technical form, adequate intensity, and having someone to objectively help you do that should all be done before you decide to pile on more. Because if any one of those is out of whack, adding more volume is actually going to be harmful, not beneficial. Like if you're sleeping 5 hours a night and you decide to pile on a bunch of volume, you just decided to dig an even deeper recovery hole. If your technique is garbage and you decide to pile on a bunch more volume, you're looking at increasing your chances of injury. If your intensity is trash, you're just spending a lot of time wasting your time when you could make the quality of work a lot higher. Like if you're chronically training at like a 4 to 5 RPE, just simply taking the current volume you're doing and getting that up to like even a 6 to 8 RPE, you might see a much greater return on investment. So I think you have to look at these results in context of what we know is the actual driver of hypertrophy, not just looking at changes in dosages to make sure you get it right, how they actually count volume, understand the population that was studied and how that's different than 90% of the studies that are out there. And then also think about the time frame of the study. It was an 8-week study. This isn't saying, hey, we looked at these people doing 45 sets for muscle group for 2 years. It may very well be that they would run into a tortoise versus the hare scenario, where they're achieving more injuries or experiencing more psychological burnout, and that the moderate volume group passes them up. So
especially which I think I believe each of the trainees, they mentioned the sets were to failure pretty much. I mean, at least like one short of failure. So I mean, especially because a lot of times it'll be, at least with traditional German volume training, it's the same sets, reps, and so you're not going to failure until the very end. Whereas this was every one, and then they adjusted the weight so that you could stay in that rep range. But I mean, that's certainly a huge stimulus. I wouldn't be surprised to see if there maybe was some of that drop off there later.
Yeah, from what Schoenfeld said, and this is an 8-week study, so it doesn't tell us a lot, that there weren't any injuries in the high volume group. But I think but 8 weeks is a time period where we've seen repeatedly studied, like, the 6 to 12 week study is 90% of exercise science. Mm-hmm. And I think most people can get through crazy levels of work at a high intensity for 6 to 12 weeks. But I don't think it's necessarily sustainable for multiple mesocycles or like half a macrocycle even. So yeah, you really have to think about the long term. And to their credit, like, James Krieger, he presented some of this data at the Ultimate Evidence-Based Conference, which was a big conference we had in Melbourne back in July, and he was talking about this, and he said, look, the only really feasible way, if you do need to do this level of volume to progress, is to do it in specialization cycles, to where, since we know that all groups grew, that's a really important thing. It wasn't like only the high volume group grew. Right. And that to maintain, you can do even less volume. You should take, 80% of your muscle groups and then put them on, like, essentially maintenance or low-ish volume, but maybe still enough to make some kind of progress. And then really jack the volume up on 1 to 2 body parts, and then do that in a cyclical fashion to kind of avoid that burnout, that injury, and to make kind of quote-unquote recuperative energy available to focus on 1 or 2 muscle groups that are really getting pounded. So I think how you interpret the results is very important, and could easily be misguided.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, in theory, I think that's a great point. I wonder how that would work out in practice, because I've heard people say that, once you get to the more advanced level, specialize in certain areas and then maintain the others. In my experience, when I've tried to specialize, or I did like an arm phase or, back phase or whatever, I do see an increase in growth and strength in those areas. I don't know if I would say over the long haul it's netted me anything. I know, like, when I was doing a back specialization, I was able to do somewhere between 30 and 35 pull-ups, and I was doing 100 for a few reps, and I was pretty happy with the progress. But once I went back to my regular volume, it seemed to kind of cut back as well. I know in theory you can maintain with lower volume, but, well, not in theory, I mean, it's studied too, but it did seem to kind of reset a little bit with my training. I don't know if you've ever seen that for you.
I've experienced the same thing. I'm actually thinking when I got to my peak in pull-ups, I was doing not nearly that many. I got like 21. And right now, I'd probably be able to get like 16 or 17.
Yeah.
However, before I did the specialization cycle and did a ton of pull-ups all the time, it would have been 12. So I think it's kind of one of those things. An easy way, a more objective way of doing this is if you look at like powerlifting training, where it's not uncommon to specialize in 1 or 2 lifts. That during that phase of frequent 1RM training on the lift, you're going to have an elevated peak. But your 1 rep max is going to go up and be the highest during the time you're really focusing on that lift, and maybe after a taper. But what you really care about is like, what's your 1 rep minimum, And so I remember because this is fresh in my mind with my hip injury, I was benching every day. Every day I trained at least, which was, 4 to 6 days per week. And then I went through a period where every single one of those sessions, I started with 3 all the way getting up to all 6, started with a conservative max attempt on bench. So something between a 9 to 10 RPE. And that was when I hit that 363 bench. And I can't hit a 363 now. And I randomly tried it when I was in Austin with the rest of the 3DMJ team in, I guess that was December. And ended up having like a 350th bench, So if you think about it, before that cycle, I wasn't benching 350 though. I was like 330, 340. Sure. So yeah, you will see that the peak in quote unquote fitness, if you will, during the period where you're trying to peak it. But then so long as it doesn't fall back below baseline, you've kept something. Right. And then it's kind of, you stack and layer those over and over, and then you look up 5 years from now and you go, all right, I'm progressing.
Right. Yeah. How much did you weigh when you got that 350 or 363?
The 363, I was at 98 kilos. So I was, what is that, like 215, 216? Somewhere like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's about the way you compete. You've competed in powerlifting before, but
like 25 times or something like that.
Yeah, but not well, I mean, because bodybuilding, it's been how many competitions for bodybuilding?
So I've done 3 seasons, 9 shows, and then I've been doing powerlifting since 2006. And the last meet I did was 2016. I've done over 20 meets. I typically compete in the 93 kilo class. Back when I was in the States, I competed in the 198s or the 220s. I only did the 220s like once or twice. That was just me being fat after a bodybuilding season gone bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, like my best total is 617 and a half at 93.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, I know you mentioned getting into like a brief stint with Olympic lifting. You tried it, right? But I don't think you ended up. Was it Olympic lifting?
Yeah, it wasn't very good. Like there's a reason why some Eastern Bloc and Asian countries start, people at like almost damn near 3 years old. I started at 30 years old, so that didn't. I wasn't very mobile. So.
Yeah. I was just kind of laughing in my head when you started rattling off those studies, because you and one other guy I talked to in this industry, like we've had some back and forth on Facebook and things where I'll say something and I'll say, like, I think I have a good grasp of this. And then you'll be like, well, that's a reasonable point. But have you considered these like 30 other studies? It's like, well, let me go take a few hours and I'll be back in here.
Well, for what it's worth, it is being an academic and also having a research review. It's not like a special talent I have. Like I'm one of the uncanny X-Men, and it's like PubMed recall. It's literally just spending hours per week doing things like that. So yeah.
Right. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I just had one or two more questions here. So with the volume and backing off, what we kind of talked about, the idea of strategic deconditioning, it kind of goes back, and Brian Haycock, I think his name was, for AHST, hypertrophy specific training. That's, way back now. Do you find, because I've seen actually quite a lot of debate there where he actually advises 2 weeks at times completely away from training. And there does seem to be, at least from the studies I've seen, there's an increased response afterwards. But I think when you factor in that you might lose a little bit in 2 weeks, and I just don't know too many people who do that, who take consistently 2 weeks off at a time. And I don't think you guys do that either. So given that some of the studies show that, why do you feel that way or not feel that way?
That's a great question. First, I just want to give Brian Haycock some mad props, because we're talking, I think, early 2000s, late 90s. He was saying, hey, we need to have a frequency more like 2 to 3 times per week and split the volume up per session. And he essentially was predicting the outcome of meta-analyses and systematic reviews that were still, 5 years to a decade or more away. And he got way more right than he got wrong. And just kind of piecing together the research and having a 3-day per week full body approach, where by the end of the week you're doing 10 to 20 sets per muscle group, and focusing on beating the logbook. Man, like that falls in line with 90% of the guidelines. I think the only thing he's got a little bit wrong is actually strategic deconditioning, and not in a way that actually is harmful, just in a way that it's not beneficial. So if you look at the research on taking time off and coming back, you do get an enhanced response until you get back to where you were. And then it's right back to the same speed. Now, you can look at that and go, well, that could be useful. And I think it is. The useful thing to know is that it's not a big deal if you take a week or two off. Like that frees you up over weekends. It does a few other things. But I think it's also worth noting that what we're comparing in research are typically static programs to another program where you take time off. And in reality, there might be more progressive approaches that someone is taking rather than just doing the same static approach, taking time off and coming back to it. And you're not just losing and regaining the adaptation, but also the work capacity and ability to handle that volume. So it may be that you are putting yourself in a position where you kind of have to restart to some degree, being able to handle the amount of workload you have to do to progress at a certain training age. So there's, I think the way I look at it, it's not a big deal to take a week or two off, not at all, especially now that we know things about the way muscle memory works, which, knowing that there's an epigenetic cascade of once you come back, if you're regaining old gains, that'll happen really quickly, and a lot of genes get turned on to help that grow. And then if we look at least in animal models, which we think is probably going to hold true in humans, the myonuclei remain, even though the fibers themselves might atrophy a little bit. So meaning that they grow back quite quickly. And if you tack all that on top of the fact that the motor pattern and motor learning related to the movements you're doing and ability to turn on everything is just not going to degrade in 2 weeks. Yeah, muscle memory makes sense, and it'll come back real quick. So it's not like you're going to lose a lot of gains in a week or even 2 weeks, or maybe even like 3 or 4 weeks. I think you'd be surprised at how quickly things would come back. And I could definitely echo that, having been forced to take more like 6 weeks off from certain movements when I got surgery. So I think anyone who has been in the game a while and who's gotten injured and has had to come back is pleasantly surprised in most cases. And that their fears don't match up with reality. So that's the good news, is while I don't think strategic deconditioning is going to help you grow bigger than if you didn't use it, I think it is really nice to know that if you do get in a rut or you're beat up or you're traveling or whatever, 1 to 2 weeks is going to be something you would never know even occurred if you look back a few years later.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of amazing how fast that happens and how fast it comes back. And I think there is a psychological benefit to it, but I know it almost used to frustrate me back like a couple of years ago, because I would have friends who would take weeks off at a time. I'm like, why are you the same size as me or stronger than me? You're taking all this time off, and it comes back to that whole comparing to everybody else type of thing. But yeah, there's a lot of people I know who, if they spend a lot of time building up that size, they can kind of be a little bit less consistent now, and they still maintain most of it. I think the strength tends to fall off a little faster than the size, just I guess the neurological adaptations and whatnot, but they seem to get it back very quickly. So that's very interesting, I think.
That's actually one thing I've consistently seen, is that back in the day when I was a personal trainer, I would have novices, we're talking, 75-year-old woman who's getting into training for the first time. She would take a week off after training with me consistently and come back stronger just because she's less fatigued, right?
Sure.
But when I watch, and myself, when I've seen high-level powerlifters or Olympic lifters take even a week off, they typically have an immediate drop in top-end strength on the more skilled movements especially, and it takes a little bit to come back. And it's not really, it's not like the percentage, if you look at the percentage, it's quite low. Like they might go from let's say a 130 clean and jerk to a 125, 122 or something like that. So we're looking at like a 5% reduction in strength from a week off. And while that's really nothing, and it might take another week to get that 5% back, in an absolute sense, and in terms of being competitive, all of a sudden that makes a big difference because of the differences between individuals at a high level. So yeah, like when I've watched people trying to qualify for international competition who have had to take a week off for whatever reason, that can be a very serious problem. Right. So I think it's important to put that research in context. Yeah, you'd be like, it's only like a 4% decrease in strength, and it comes back in a week or two. Like, well, if they only have 8 weeks to prep for any thing, and they're like within 3 kilos of actually qualifying, that's a huge deal. So
sure, yeah. All right, well, Eric, thank you very much for talking with us today. So let's see, we have your mass review. You guys, 3D Muscle Journey. You're on Instagram. You're on YouTube. Facebook, anywhere else people can find your information?
Yeah, check out, if you like to read, check out muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. That's my books on both nutrition and training, and we're going to get the second edition of those out near end of this year. So that's pretty much it, though. Thanks for covering the rest.
Awesome, man. Awesome.
Hey, guys. Thanks for listening to my interview with Dr. Eric Helms, who continues to put out great content in this field. If you enjoy the interview, like the video, subscribe to follow along. And if you believe in the charity being supported by this interview, please feel free to make your own donation and comment down below.